This is a spoiler.
You can't
You
listen to
know.
this and not have spoilers.
This is the passage from Kafka on the Shore where he talks about in the penal colony. He's saying this. This is with Oshima in the library, him and Kafka Tamura, which named after Kafka, the author we're reading now. That's my favorite of his short stories. No kidding? I nod. Why's that? It takes me a while to gather my thoughts. I think what Kafka does is give a purely mechanical explanation of that complex machine in the story, as a sort of a substitute for explaining the situation we're in. What I mean is, I have to give it some more thought. What I mean is, that's his own device for explaining the kind of lives we lead. Not by talking about our situation, but by talking about the details of the machine. And then Oshima says that makes sense. I imagine Franz Kafka would agree with you. Then Oshima goes away for a second, and skipping down, this is what Kafka says in a second. Oshima most likely found my explanation of the Kafka story convincing, to some extent at least. But what I really wanted to say didn't get across. I wasn't just giving some general theory of Kafka's fiction. I was talking about something very real. Kafka's complex, mysterious execution device wasn't some metaphor or allegory. It's actually here, all around me. But I don't think anybody would get that. Not Oshima, not anybody. And that's on page 58 of my edition of Kafka on the Shore.
So he's saying it's not a metaphor, it's not an allegory. It exists all around him.
Yes, that's what he says. So in order to get that, let's jump in. What's that machine? What's the function? How does it play out? What's it like in the world of the story? I'd be happy to give a summary as quickly as I can.
That's great.
Well, so we have just a few characters. A researcher is traveling into this penal colony and meeting with...
Wait. You're saying a researcher?
Yes, he's referred to as a traveling researcher. And so at different times a traveler and then the researcher.
But he's only, in the edition I'm reading, or I read, he's only referred to as traveler. And that language kind of jumped out at me a little bit.
Okay, in mine he's only referred to as an explorer, so I think we may be reading different translations.
Yeah, well, true. But what is he not referred to as? Which is really what he is, right? Is he us? Is he a judicial official? I know what he is within the context of this story per se, but it's interesting that we're all reading different translations, and the only words that are coming up are explorer, traveler, researcher. But it seemed to me that the officer was urging or trying to get this traveler explorer dude to render a verdict.
Yes, well, his position is one of a powerful opinion. His advisement would be taken by the new commandant, and that's kind of the seat of where the story turns, the changeover in time from the old commandant to the new commandant in the penal colony. So, so they get there, and the officer is showing the traveling researcher, explorer, what the machine is that has been made as punishment in the penal colony by the old commandant. And the only two figures there with him are the soldier holding in chains a condemned man. And that condemned man is going to be put into this device. And the explanation of the device takes up the first half of the story, I'd say. The officer tells him, that there are basically three components. There's a bed, there's a top machinery, and then there's a harrow, which are rows of spikes. I don't know if you've ever got like an allergy test where they have like a brick of spikes with all sorts of different things on it, but that's what I envision, just a large panel, or one of those things where you put your hand in it and the pins all raise up, except it's meant to be lowered over the body, and then vibrated according to a specific mechanical design to imprint the punishment onto the body. And as he explains this,
totally gross, by the way.
Yes, all over until death. And the process is supposed to be a sublime experience for the condemned man and for those watching because of the absolute horror of this machine. It's like the most grotesque torture device related to a crime. At one point, the traveling researcher says it's not hard to make a judgment about this because it's absolutely so horrible, and it's totally unjust because the man that's being condemned doesn't know what he's being condemned for. He didn't get a chance to defend himself. It was a straightforward punishment. And the man being condemned is being punished for striking his superior for striking him and lashing back out because he fell asleep on watch. And that is the punishable offense. And so, the officer is explaining all of this, and he's setting up the machine, and it's horrible, and its specificity, all the needles. There's another needle right beside the bigger needle that squirts water so that it cleans the blood away, and then there's a special cotton wool wrap that is meant to pull the blood from the body and also staunch the bleeding so that it can be reapplied, the tattoo machine, deeper into the skin time after time. And so as they're going through this, you get the sense that the traveling researcher is not on board with this, that it's horrible and he does not like it. And the officer says that I need you to make a good opinion of this with the new commandant. The old commandant, this is all his design. This is his machine. This is his idea. But the new commandant wants to change things. So if your opinion as the great traveling researcher were to be favorable, then I may be able to, keep things in order the way that I enjoy them. If you were to say something even vague because it's not in line with the new commandant, then him and his court of women will turn over the entire process that we have set up here. And that's interesting. I wanted to underline that because that seemed to pop up again and again, this idea of women silencing and governing the new regime. Anyhow, the traveling researcher stands up and says, no, there's no way. This is awful. And the officer goes into the machine himself. And that's whenever, because of the decay of time and machine and replacement parts, the straps are beginning to break, cogs are coming loose, it's hard to keep up. No one wants to maintain this order, and the officer is the only zealot for it. So by the time he gets into the machine for some kind of justice, knowing that this will probably be the last time that it's used and that it's over, the machine breaks down and goes completely awry and kills him quickly and gruesomely, not working like he imagined that it may, and he could connect with that sublime experience. At one point earlier, he says, those watching the condemned man by the late hour of the punishment see a kind of almost enviable position where they've completely lost sense of reality. They don't even whimper anymore. They don't have enough energy to scream. They're just understanding their punishment. They can sense the inscription, even though they can't see what's being written on them. After a while, it begins to make sense because it's not just a straight font type. It is a long process of sideways and up and down pricking that eventually lays over, like a pointillism, a great design of the punishment. And afterward, the traveler goes and sees the gravestone of the commandant, the old one, and leaves, presumably to go back from where he came from. And I think that's the long and short.
The only question that I have about that is I was under the impression that the officer had sabotaged the machine so he spent a bunch of time beforehand before he got in, and I couldn't tell when the machine started to fall apart if that was because of what, if he had just said, okay, let's get this over quick, or, it's the end, let's take it all down.
Well, I got the sense that he wanted an experience to go similarly to the machine. So that's interesting. It's not that he wanted to sabotage the process. The whole time he was preparing it for the condemned man, I think, in order with how it should function. And so whenever he gets in it, I think he expects it to go as planned. And there's an interesting part where the traveler is watching him do this. He's taking off all of his clothes and getting into this device to have everything that he just explained happen to him. And the traveler says something like, something to the effect of, if I were in his position, I may very well do the same thing. It made sense as a kind of justice. And he had no reason to stop him from doing this to himself. Though whenever the officer gets in, everything goes wrong very quickly, and he does not get anything close to what he imagined, and it's actually, very just a crude murder rather than an elaborate torture.
But this worked the way he described it previously, right? That's the whole point. It worked in the past, right?
I think the timeline was that the officer himself condemned himself. I mean, he was judged by the traveler, or the device was judged immoral by the traveler. But then the officer himself understood, and I think he grabbed one of those sheets that was to be imprinted, and I think the sheet was to represent "be just." And then I thought he was like skippering around the machine, setting it up for himself. And then when it started at first, the gears that made a lot of noise and the imperfections of the machine at first all went away, and it was a quiet, seamless experience, right? And only into the torture did things start to break down to the point that the harrow stabbed him rather than right on his skin, etc., etc. But I thought one of the important things was that when he first did that, the machine at first ran perfectly as in times past.
Yeah, there was no sound from that squeaky gear.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Saying something.
I think it's also important that the machine is decaying. That this is not it's set up in retrospect the way it's told. We know nothing of it except as it's described to us, so we hear about a past state of glory and design, though what we see in the real world is the straps that are breaking.
And that there were kids that would be watching up close, right?
Yes, that were taken as a priority as watchers.
Right.
And that people wouldn't even look but would just listen to the sounds of agony.
But it seemed, I got a sense that they took great delight in that. Am I wrong? At that time, in the past.
It was, I think someone mentioned that, because I got the same sense, Laura, but mentioning it as a transformative experience. So I'm not sure if it was like a happy thing or if it was just such a, insane or crazy experience that, uncomparable to any other.
Yeah, filled with awe.
I wasn't sure if what was trying to be got at was just some, a cheap thrill that we connect with executions of, times in the past, of a revelry at a party. I thought there was a deeper knowledge that these people are trying to attain in witnessing this thing.
In the past, you mean?
In the story, what I get from what I would think of when I hear of medieval hangings and even lynchings in the past, I think of it as a revelry amongst a crowd mob mentality.
But Kafka's making a comment on that, because obviously in the course of the story, it's changing. Everything's changing, and he's imposing his point of view in terms of how man treats man, or human treats human, and the violence. That's what I get from the story, that it's a process of change.
I think that's what's one of the things that's so fascinating about reading Kafka is that I can't think of another author where you can get so many readings out of a single text. And the biographies that I've read kind of indicate to me that he was very much aware of writing to critics and the avant-garde, and he was selective about the places in which he would publish, and so he kind of nurtured this ambiguity. I mean, really, to me, to a degree that I can't think of another author I've read who's mastered it kind of in this way. But he really played it up so that you could read almost infinite kinds of interpretations into his text, but at the same time, I mean, they say so much, right? I mean, there's a very lurid details. It's kind of what's fascinating because I see the change that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Then, there's whispers or there's allusions at the end to the old commandant's return. And, I mean, I think there's different readings of that you could have. I mean, that bystanders kind of look at the explorer as if, isn't this a joke? Don't you agree? It's silly. But you could you could read it as though it's a kind of a cyclical idea of progress. The brutality, will come and go. We move away from it. Maybe, this style of execution, but I mean, as we see in our own time, it crops back up. Can you ever put it down for good? You can row away in your little boat, but, the shore which you arrive, will it not arrive there after you? The two guys who wanted to jump into the boat with him, he kind of waved away with the rope, threatening them.
Yeah, in a threatening way, so that indicates, that it is cyclical.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because didn't the world gleefully watch Saddam Hussein hang?
Right.
Wasn't that long ago?
Right.
Yes, well, in looking up penal colonies, the last entry in the Wikipedia was Guantanamo Bay.
Right.
Oh,
and it occurred to me what a penal colony really represented. Most of them were mid-early, throughout the 18th century, say. Few survived, some in Asia into the 20th century, the early 20th century before World War II. And, some nations were used as them. This is all just recounting, but it's helping me understand the environment that we're dropped into immediately. And that it's not just that this is some kind of citizenry execution. It's not something like the electric chair, which is crude in its own way and could be described similarly as this horrible device, I believe. Though it's a penal colony specifically. And, this is what's, where prisoners must, be, living all together in this, exiled community. And
like Australia.
Yeah, I was going to say, Australia was.
Yes, and apparently North America was also used as a penal colony for early times.
What? When? You mean with the Pilgrims?
There was what was it? It was the British had a bunch of people that they brought over to the San Andaman Islands, I think. That was what I was just looking up beforehand. Not as early as Pilgrims, I don't think. And I'm not sure what kind of what the constituency of the penal colony was. That's right. No, I wondered about that, and then I found the answer. It was a debtors colony. And so what essentially happened is people who, in debtors prison who couldn't pay their bills were turned into labor forces. The same thing with Siberia and Tripoli also, all of them used for their remoteness. So Australia, North America, the middle of Siberia, and the Sahara Desert.
You can add Canada to that list for, I know I just read about it, Japanese internment in northern Canada happened during World War II.
Oh, geez. I think what struck, I read this years ago when I was in college, but probably didn't pay as much attention to it as I did now, and I think I was completely blown away by the horror of this machine, and also that kind of freaked me out what you said, Daniel, about how you had read that Kafka wrote to the critics. Because I was thinking to myself, where where in one human being's mind can something this so brutal come out? Obviously, it's a stupid question because the brutality exists throughout all of society and all of history and all of humanity. But it just was shocking to me. I mean, shocking. I mean, for instance, I'm a writer, and I had to write this, or I did write this scene, a rape scene actually, which was very difficult to write. And people have read it and said, I can't read that. And I was reading this, and I was like, my God, I could never imagine something so brutal. Mm. It is quite shocking to me that a human being could imagine this brutality, and in a way, it's a comment on all of us, that we all have this ability somewhere to come up with this brutality. Obviously, we do.
I think that ties back into Kafka on the Shore, and just my feeling in the book that Kafka had to come to terms with his own violence, with the idea that humans are violent, and get over it. Get over get to a place where he could actually live in quotes, a normal life, get by that, or come to terms with it, I guess. That's the word I want, that's the phrase I want.
I didn't remember hearing it in what Nathan read, but wasn't there a part from Kafka on the Shore where Kafka says something to the effect of, we're all in the penal colony?
I don't know if he said it or not, but it seems to fit.
It would make sense.
Okay. I mean, when I read the title, that's what I think about. Like, when he talks about how guilt must only be accused or suggested in order for the sentence to be carried out. There's kind of this suggestion there that we're all already guilty. You need no more than that, and it's all inclusive. And I don't know. I mean, trying to make that fit with the explorer. I think he's called a foreigner too at the end of my translation. He's kind of an other. He's there as an impartial observer, and he's going to leave again. But he understands, even as an observer, his own culpability, and he's very much aware as soon as he pronounces his judgment that it is a judgment and that it will have consequences. So I don't know. It's then he's in the penal colony, but he's not of the penal colony in a way, and I wasn't sure exactly about his role.
Well, I don't know for a little. Oh, sorry.
That's right, Mary. Go ahead.
I just there's so many ways to interpret it. For a little while, I thought about him as modernity. It's just the symbol of human beings, progressing, again in quotes, and what we think of our ancestry and what we think of history and how history is interpreted. And we come along and say, God, they were so barbaric, and then we have public hangings. So, but I thought you kind of it's fine. Go ahead, come to the island, take a look, and then you get to leave. But you don't, you're not in the circumstance that got people to the penal colony. You don't live that actual life. So.
I've been thinking about what Daniel said regarding this concept of the idea of guilt, right? That really is put forth through this, that really we all are guilty. I mean, the condemned man was never put on trial, obviously. It was just, he just didn't salute, so he couldn't be executed. I mean, this concept, this idea of innocent until proven guilty, wasn't that even revolutionary when it was brought up in the United States when we brought it in? I mean, in other words, in the past, in medieval times, you weren't innocent until proven guilty, correct? Isn't that what he was saying?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to read the religious interpretation into that because we're all born with original sin, and
right.
So it's an easy place to put that in. We're all guilty.
Right, but I see it in the course of the story that there's a change taking place through the traveler or foreigner or whatever he is, that actually, no, we're not all born guilty.
Well, I think because the new commandant, who is clearly opposed to this form of punishment, I think specifically says that the way that in our circle now that we try these things is that we do let the accused have a defense. But I think the way Kafka portrays, I think there's a division that we haven't talked about between the officer and the traveler, who is in the scene with the soldier and the condemned. And it's specifically stated that the traveler and the officer are speaking in French, which the other two clearly cannot understand, even though they're straining their ears and for the life of them trying to figure out exactly what's going on. And as the officer is showing this contraption to the traveler, in a morbid sort of fascination, the traveler notices that the condemned man is even more attentive to how this thing works than the traveler is in figuring it out. And the condemned man is, I don't know how Kafka does this, but is portrayed in such a inhuman, dumb way. Like I don't know if at one point they say he's drooling or just looking slovenly. And even when he's released, it's such an inhuman reaction. I mean, if you would think of someone trying to write this book and trying to write what people would actually do, well, the sheer horror of being released from such a punishment, I can't imagine what that would do to your psyche. But in this case, the condemned man is simply dancing naked for the soldier because he sort of thinks that that's what he's supposed to do. And then he's begging the traveler to let him witness the execution in this dramatic way, to the point where he's begging and getting on his knees.
Yeah.
My point simply being that I think even though the commandant is saying that now we're more humane and letting the accused mount a defense, he's also saying at the same time, these accused are hardly capable of even understanding those words in a way.
Hence lawyers. Speaking as one myself. But then we know very little too.
Don't think you can incorporate the penal colony in your firm's advertisement campaign.
Yeah, they'd love that.
Well, there were a couple of interesting parallels. So I was thinking about the trial with that this man doesn't know what he's being convicted of, and the punishment is this kind of unto death thing. You know, if it were a metaphor, this thing for life, this machine for life, then it slowly works on you what your punishment is until you die, and you slowly realize it only in the late hour of your experience with it, and you figure out what your crime is as you are killed as a punishment for it, and then thrown into a pit.
You mean this is life?
Yeah, that's if it were a metaphor, and I'm not saying that it is, but yeah. I think that it's striking that way.
Well, especially since the machine is designed theoretically to actually etch into the skin. What was it? What is it specifically? It's etching in.
Yeah, it's like stabbing. There's this one bit where he's talking about. We were just talking about explaining to the condemned man, what it is, and that he's being done to him. And the officer says, this is going back and forth between the traveler and the officer. The traveler, does he know his sentence? No, said the officer. He doesn't know his own sentence? No, said the officer again. And then he halted for a moment, as though to get from the traveler some sort of justification for such a question, and then went on. It would be useless to tell him. It will be put to him physically.
So it's going to etch in his skin what he's guilty of.
Yes, and the sketch was made by the commandant. So say it is, his punishment is respect your superiors, something like that. However, the actual sketch, which is kept in a private ledger, safe because it's used in the machine to define the inscription, is actually broadly detailed and decorated. The words itself are just a narrow band, it says. However, the entire body is used for the adornment of these letters. I'm sorry?
The adornments you're saying are etched into the skin as well.
Yes. So the real horror, I think, is the elaborations from the sentence.
Well,
it's not the sentence
it's
itself.
going to take that much longer, and it's going to be that much more brutal.
Yes, and it also shows a personally human side of this, because this machine was designed by a man, right? This was the brainchild of a commandant. He
Right.
was a chemist and an engineer and a draftsman. So he was able to completely create this, and it's all his vision, even the inscription. And so if his inscriptions are elaborately decorated, so to put it more painfully, or to drive the point home, then what does that say about him and the old commandant, who we never meet and who is buried in a tea house with just a gravestone from his followers because the priest wouldn't allow him in the common graveyard?
Under a table, right?
Under a table. Yeah. I have one more thing I wanted to add about the condemned man. This is just aesthetic, but he reminded me of Lucky and Pozo from oh God, what's the play again? Anyway, the man with
Waiting for Godot.
Yes, with his manservant, on a leash or whatever, and he's just so completely beaten. He's just so condemned that the only thing he can do is try and figure out what's going on. So the whole time he's got a bent ear listening to what's going to happen to him because he doesn't know. He's not been privy to any of this. He hasn't been charged. He's just going to be punished. And then whenever the officer is busted and realizes the traveler's not going to be on his side, and so the old era is done, and he strips down. This is, I think, really interesting. It wasn't until the officer stood there completely naked that they took notice. The condemned man in particular seemed struck by the sense of some vast reversal in their roles. The thing that had happened to him was now happening to the officer. Perhaps it would continue to the end. Probably it was on some order given by the foreign traveler. That was his vengeance. Without himself having suffered to the limit, he would be avenged to that limit. An expression of broad, silent mirth appeared on his face and did not leave it. And then he's entranced by the machine and wants to see what he narrowly escaped. He understands that.
I like that you brought up Waiting for Godot, because what I've read is from Beckett, Kafka comes up a lot. He is definitely a careful reader of Kafka. And his first novel, America, there's the main character at one point is on the road and he falls in with these two tramps. And it's very reminiscent, or Waiting for Godot it's very reminiscent of that. So if you ever want to see more of that influence, that's a good novel to read.
Wow.
I wanted to mention, it was mentioned that Kafka wrote for the critics, and I think my lack of literary criticism knowledge will come out here, but just bear with me. When I think about writing a book or even reading a book, it's mainly or it involves writing a set of believable characters and sort of putting them through actions, having them develop as characters. And then there's Kafka, who straddles this. I mean, Murakami said it's not allegorical, but it seems like it's almost simple as to be terrible. It's almost the short story is almost just like capital punishment is bad, and yet it's so much more complex. I don't know how he goes about breaking these rules without having believable human characters doing believable human things and still have a deep short story. It seems like he's breaking every rule of writing and somehow still managing to make it work.
You mean in terms of the characters?
Yeah, like I mentioned the condemned man, for instance. If someone were to write that as a human character, there's no way he could be doing what he's doing in that story. the traveler may be the most believable person, maybe a stock human character, but everyone else is on a plane of ridiculousness.
Well, I mean, the thing is, what strikes me is that, first of all, it's a short story, and in a short story, well, the operative word is short. So I'm not saying that characters aren't developed in a short story, but really there's something else at work, that your goal in creating a short story. But in here, when I think about these characters and their either development or lack of development, I just think they're developed in a way to service what Kafka is trying to say. You know what I'm saying? In other words, the condemned man is developed in the way that Kafka needs him to be developed in order to show his stupidity, the limits of his ability to understand what's going on or what's happening. And because of that, really what the officer's trying to do and the machine will be doing is that much more brutal, because the condemned man understands that much less. So, I mean, I understand your sort of what you're talking about, fully developing characters, but I think that in this case, the characters developed to the point where, in a way that Kafka needed them to be developed to write this particular story.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm actually very impressed by how he does this. I'm more impressed by him using these characters and escaping the completely allegorical, as though, the soldier is not just a stand-in for power, or the condemned man is not just a stand-in for, like, the poor and mistrodden in society. Like, there's just this weird level to them that I wouldn't, if I sat down and was going to write something, I wouldn't have the creativity or imagination to come up with, because if I thought to myself, what would a person in this situation do, or anything along those lines, I could never come up with what Kafka seems to come up with.
Well, I think the machine does it all. You know what I'm saying? I mean,
yeah, I think that the writing itself, Cesare, I agree that it's just, I mean, it's like he had the finest of paring knives to pare down each character to they had to be. I thought it was really beautiful. I mean, horrifying, yes, but the story, but the writing was, I'm always astounded.
Well, I think that in this particular situation, I think, when I say it's the machine that does it, I think the machine gives the way the machine is constructed, the officer goes through a long period where he describes specifically what the machine is, how the machine is made, what it's made of, how it functions, what it does. And I think that creates this sort of color, this environment that sort of in itself creates these characters.
Mm-hmm.
Like its character in and of itself. It's the most developed, profound, overwhelming character in this story, but I think those other characters around it kind of service it and are sort of created from it.
Yeah, I think both in this story and the Metamorphosis, like, he constructs this situation or this apparatus in this story that's so lurid in its detail, but so alien at the same time. And it's a neat trick to be able to go into such exquisite, horrific kind of detail about this alien thing that it's not actually a thing in reality. So you get what I think he does with that is he's able to create a situation where he can, on the one hand, have this tremendous specificity in describing these processes that are like at once alien and very close to home, but then it creates such transparent metaphors that it's so easy to see different facets of life in those processes that in Kafka on the Shore, he talks a lot about, Murakami talked a lot about metaphor and the ways that they're kind of passages between experiences and you make meaning through those connections. And and things like that. And I think Kafka is just kind of a master of that. And that's really all I meant when I meant that he wrote for the critics. I don't think that was his main goal at all. I just think he was very aware of the ways that his stories could read, and he was good at manipulating the avant-garde readership that he cultivated through the places that he would publish. And so some of these situations that he creates in his stories, they lend themselves so perfectly to so many different readings that they give the critics a lot to do. But I think that in and of itself it's not all that fascinating. What's fascinating to me is that you can, kind of like Cesare was saying, you can do that, but also get so personal with it. I mean, you can really feel for these characters, and you can say, okay, well, I've never been in a weird trial where somebody came and pulled me out of my bedroom in my underwear and just drug me through all these crazy situations that were oppressive and invasive and all of that. But you can see those feelings in the things that happen in your own life. You can see that kind of subjection to bureaucracy or insignificance in the face of religion or metaphysics in your own life in different situations without needing to, turn into a bug.
Yeah, but are you saying that that's the same case here?
In a different sense, I think he's doing something different. I mean, there's so many different readings of this story that I love. Like, one of my favorites is kind of the confrontation between the material and the immaterial, or the meaningless and the meaning. Like, the machine itself, maybe I like kind of reading as a metaphor for the human condition. Right. You have the three parts, the bed, which is kind of totally meaningless. It's just a platform. It's a material ground upon which the body is laid. And then the designer, which is meant to translate that meaning into something that the hero can carve into the body. And I guess I see, like, the person being laid on the bed is the place where the material, dead, inert, meaningless, meets the inscription of meaning. And that is a experience of suffering, I guess. And the inscription of meaning into meaninglessness is a process of suffering, maybe, which is kind of horrific, but it's a reading that I think is interesting and fruitful.
Interesting.
I love that I didn't, that you can play so much with your own interpretations while you're reading the story. So he's really a master. And that, I don't have any, I didn't have any discomfort thinking, oh, is this what he meant? It was just, you could just play with it the whole time. Oh, if he was talking about this, and this could be this, and this could be that. You could read so much into it. I thought that it's just so rich, so ripe for playing with.
Yeah, I agree.
And also, it's really dramatic. I mean, for me, I thought that this would be like a great, like, Tarantino movie or something.
Totally agree.
Right?
I don't want to see it if Tarantino makes it. Yeah. I really. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what I really like about it is the opening, where it's, like, really, it could be funny. Like, it could be played for fun. You've got
Bill Murray as the officer.
Yeah.
Bureaucratic love story.
Oh, we just made $1 million. I mean, he's talking about this machine, and he's like, okay, so here's the contraptions, and, I can't wait to show you this, and, this is how the machines work, and then he asks a question, but what's his sentence? And he's like, you don't know? Oh, okay, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you. Let me go through this. Oh, I wish I had more time to tell you this. I'm getting carried away. Anyway, we got to do this. But these are the needles, and it's just, and then he describes this horrible process, and then he's like, and it's beautiful, right? And so that at first has this awkward tension where you get this very enthusiastic approach to the horror and the things that he's revealing to you, like in Murakami's writing. We talked about this in the other conversation. The matter-of-factness or the plainness of the horror is what adds to it as well. So whenever he straightforwardly gives you a very fast run of the design, which is like pricking needles and blood and nails and then stabbing, and at the end it just is kind of left like vibrating, like you can't believe it got that dark that fast, and then everything takes a very dramatic turn. So the condemned man is set free. The officer of the machine is being subdued to the machine. And not only is everything that you've heard, that exposition of how the machine will work in principle or how it has worked, it's laid over top of the reality of now, where the machine is in decay and it's rotting. And as soon as I was reading the beginning, there was a part where the officer says, well, this is the machine. Hopefully we don't have any malfunctions today. And I was like, that's foreshadowing. I got to remember that. And then I completely forgot about it by the end whenever he crawls into the machine. And you're expecting to see everything that he said go as planned. And then it doesn't fast. It just goes another way. And there's a kind of justice in that asymmetry, I think. Something that he had planned on and also the traveler had planned on. So whenever the officer thinks that he's, in my reading, enacting some final form of justice and thinks he knows what he's getting into, he lays his own plans for the inscription down. This is what he thinks his crime is, and he's in control. He's, doesn't have to be tied down. He's getting ready to kick the lever, but then people help him, and he's like, good, I'm glad they made me a proper prisoner. He said so in my reading with his actions. And then everything goes off, and he experiences maybe the beginning of it, easily and perfectly, but then it goes off the rails. The cogs start coming out and the machine breaks down, and he's stabbed through without getting that that painful ecstasy.
Think about that metaphorically. I mean, okay, so at that point the machine breaks down and it's doing exactly not what the officer said it would do or should do. So then who is the officer at that moment when the machine is doing that to him? In other words, would it have broken down like that if the condemned man had stayed in there?
Mm.
I guess that the reason that I wondered if he had sabotaged it was because it did work so perfectly when he first got in. I mean, it was remarkable that that gear didn't make the squeaking sound. And so, whether or not it was I just kind of felt like he wanted this last hurrah for the machine. Like if he wanted to go out with it or go down with the boat or something. And a little bit of that made the colonialism reading of it a little bit more interesting to me. It's like, oh, okay, here we are. We're stepping into India before, at the end of the colonial era or something like that. And I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, I think so too, because he absolutely was a believer. I mean, like Nathan was talking about, you really felt the zeal come across in his descriptions of the apparatus. And he goes, pretty much without hesitation to lay himself into the machine once the explorer pronounces his judgment. And I mean, I think in a colonial situation, I mean, you probably would not see the oppressive figures in those, the colonizers, take upon themselves some kind of sacrifice, with such willingness, faced with, some impartial opinion of their actions. I mean, we don't really see that in reality. And that kind of lends a different view to that to me. Like, cause I think that reading is there, but I think he's definitely identifying with what he's doing on a very, very deep level, so that, if he needs to completely sacrifice himself and go through this process that he's just given to the explorer in such rich and horrible detail, he'll do it without a second thought. And that's pretty powerful, I think. And it raises the question to me, what exactly is at stake for him in keeping the torch of the old commandant.
Yeah. I've read stories about people who, at the end of the colonial era, various people who came back to the UK after having been posted having some colonial post for most of their lives, and just not being able to cope with the loss of that lifestyle. They couldn't.
That's all
cope.
they knew.
Yeah, it's all they knew. And so here's the officer.
In what way? Like not being able to let go of the power or readjust?
Yeah, I just remember reading one time about and I don't know what his title was when he was in India, but coming back to the UK and just he had no idea how to make a pot of tea. He had always had people waiting on him. He was completely lost without the structure, without, having lost his post. And the world had changed so much. His reality had changed so much from something that he had become so used to that he just couldn't cope. I wish I could remember where I read about it. It was fascinating.
I read an account, if you've read King Leopold's Ghost, which was about the atrocities in the Congo, the Belgian Congo. And I think that was not that account, but those experiences were used by Conrad in Heart of Darkness to describe those characters and their experiences. And it's eerie how this non-fictional account really conforms to the Heart of Darkness narrative as far as what you're saying, people not being able to cope, these horrible conditions in the Congo, and yet given the choice to go back to England with their riches, they chose to stay and keep doing these things.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So, let me get what everybody's saying. You're saying that the officer could not change.
What I got is that, the apparatus was something that was invented and built by humans, by people, by this old commandant with the help of the officer.
Right.
And it's, to me, it reminds me of just structures that we as humans create. We just do this naturally, like, the law, the economy. And, I think if you think about it, we think that these are things that are created to serve us as humans, but they quickly transform into independent beings that are meant to be served. You can just think of the way people talk about the economy as far as we have to, help the economy or as though it was this being.
Interesting you said it, because I just saw an article where Stephen Hawking talked about how he's very scared of artificial intelligence, i.e. robots. And other people are like, wait a minute, man creates robots. So how can you get scared of something that we create?
Yeah. And I think just to sum up quickly, the overall message to me with the officer going down with the machine is that we're not the sort of rational beings that can just put off these creations that have been made, the apparatus in this case. But the only way that these things are destroyed is simply everyone that's invested in them dies with them.
Right.
Almost in the same sense that, when the communists took over in Russia, they killed all the aristocracy, right?
Right.
Well, and we built huge nuclear arsenals. So, yeah, we
That's
made terrible machines.
Yeah. Oh, God. I remember that quote. Actually, I swear did I hear that last night. That quote by Robert Oppenheimer, "I am the creator of death." He's the man who created the atomic bomb.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me think of the machine.
Yeah. Yeah, and you look at Oppenheimer and wow, no amount of backpedaling saved him in the end.
Yeah.
How do you mean that? Did he have... how do you mean that? Did he... I don't know the story of Oppenheimer except, for creating nuclear technology or having a hand in it.
He basically tried to stop the United States. He had a series of postings as a scientific advisor for the U.S. and was brought down for his anti-bomb, or, well, what did he want to do? I think the thing that he wanted to do was share. Sorry?
Yeah, I'm just following up on you saying even though he created the atomic bomb, he said, I created death.
Yeah.
He didn't want a part of that. He became very vocal about being anti, war or bombs.
He was preaching sanity at a time when there was absolutely no reason, no ear for that. So.
But anyway, it makes me think of this machine that, the commandant, the old commandant, the officer created this machine. They created death.
Yeah, I think so. And unlike Oppenheimer, the officer to the commandant wants to live in that glory. We were just talking about the institution that he knew and learned from and wanted to enact and keep enacting.
Yeah, but meanwhile, the new commandant doesn't want that.
Yes, and he has this plan that he's going to give a speech with the help of the traveler. So if the traveler will back him up, then the officer will have a chance to give this speech to the new commandant and make him bow before the ideals of the old commandant. And this is his hope for glory.
Right. Meanwhile, the new commandant did not have a hand in creating the machine.
That's right.
The old commandant did. However, if you think of the hierarchy of power, commandants are more powerful or in superior positions to the officer, right? So the officer can't change. He doesn't want to change. His meaning of life is this death machine, right?
Yeah. So he could be a priest. He could be. There's so many. Again, it's so glorious how many ways you can read this.
Yeah, but I'm thinking about, since we brought in the Oppenheimer idea, that Oppenheimer was not only the one that created the atomic bomb, but as the creator, he also became vocally against using the atomic bomb because, as he said, he created death. And here we have, the old commandant is dead, but here we have the new commandant who didn't have a hand in creating it, but is obviously in the superior position to decide what happens to it or how it's, right? And he's going against using this machine of death. So essentially, I think the officer is struggling to get the traveler, foreigner, whatever it is, explorer, to support keeping the machine because then the officer has a reason to live.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's explicit, right? The entire, the new commandant sent the traveler there to check out the device. The officer showing it to him. He realizes that he's in an old state and wants to be revived. He wants the machine that's not being able to be repaired anymore. He puts in orders for new parts. Can't get them. Everything's on its way out, and he wants the traveler to back him up. And he has this plan, he has this vision for how it's going to go down. And when the traveler says no to those plans, that's when he turns on a dime and pulls out a sentence and goes up and changes it. And that's his own sentence,
Right.
Be just. And,
Right.
He has it inscribed on him as well. I think about these generational changes, so someone like a new commandant puts a status quo in order, execution device, and then he has an officer contain its function and maintain it. And then as time passes, the power shifts from the new commandant who dies to another commandant, and now we have the officer as the only pivot point there, and he's the last remaining carrier of the sketches and knows how to work with the machine, and he's set up this world, and it kind of reminds me of No Country for Old Men, or just the idea of that what you have is in a new context. So all your experiences are couched from, maybe you've grown up, for 60 years, but now you're living in a time that's past that 60 years, but you still remember what it was like, though it's not matching up to the world around you, and the country is radically different, or the landscape of the political environment is very different. And all you have left is everything you've ever known. And so what do you do about that? You can radically change everything, but then you lose your huge investment and all of your knowledge and specialties and your meaning for life. And so it seems that the officer chooses to go out to the fullest maxim of his job, which is to be, a part of the process and end it, fulfill the teleology, I suppose.
Yeah, his devotion is really just to the fullest extent that it could be. And I was interested in what it was that was personally at stake for him. And I think that's a good explanation, Nathan, that it's his way of life, his function in society that's kind of at stake. But there's another aspect of it too, which is the theme of art, I think, because one of the things that he mentions frequently, and I wish I had a quote right in front of me, but he talks about the artistry of the way that the hero inscribes onto the body the sentence, and he's very much in thrall of this particular method of execution. He just feels that this form of justice is just like the perfect expression of, merging the crime with the sentence and the body. It's just like kind of this perfect distillation of justice, I guess. And there's something about that, I think, that lends his devotion some of its zeal as well, and that maybe the new commandant doesn't have an understanding of that. He talks about it's funny because so much of Kafka is ostensibly about cutting through bureaucracy, or the briar patch of bureaucracy, and really just it's such a frustrating experience to read his novels and just get mired in all of that, But there's this passage in here it's almost kind of the antithesis of that. He talks about when he's talking about the condemned man, and when he shook his master's legs and said, "Throw that whip away, or I'll eat you alive." He says, "That's the evidence. The captain came to me an hour ago. I wrote down his statement and appended the sentence to it. Then I had the man put in chains. That was all quite simple. If I had first called the man before me and interrogated him, things would have gotten into a confused tangle. He would have told lies, and had I exposed these lies, he would have backed them up with more lies, and so on and so forth. As it is, I've got him, and I won't let him go. Is that quite clear now? But we're wasting time. The execution should be beginning, and I haven't finished explaining the apparatus yet." So it's almost as if this method of execution is cutting through the tangle of all that bureaucracy in a completely horrible way, which is usually exactly the opposite of the sense you get from reading Kafka, right? I mean,
yeah.
You're usually screaming to yourself like, "Good God, can something happen? Can we have some progress?"
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the execution never did happen.
Not to the
Not
condemned.
the condemned man, no. Something did happen, but not the execution.
Yeah, I think that's what's really interesting. Please.
So I have a question. I was wondering, there were any number of points where I thought, I'm really going to go back and think about this, but then I never did, so I'm sorry. I'm not prepared. What the fuck with the women?
Yes,
Doesn't mention women until halfway through the book, and it's always the commandant and his women. Although, there's when the condemned man has been given 2 handkerchiefs by the ladies.
Right.
He says ladies instead of women. But I was really, it shocked me when the first time that I read the commandant and his women, early in the morning the commandant appeared with his women. Like, what? When do women come into this?
Like a coven or something.
Yeah, and at first I was like, wow,
Well,
wonder
yeah,
if this is a woman hating thing, or if this is these are the trappings. Like, oh, okay, you get to be the commandant, you get the babes.
Nathan, and you posted something about Kafka's love letters, right? So, what was Kafka's position about women? I mean, I don't know.
Oh, I just posted it. I didn't read it myself.
Oh.
Well, he was very romantic and very.
So why would you post that in relation to this particular story that we're reading?
Oh, it was just a connection to Kafka at all. I thought that it might help. I do have a passage here though that's anyway, he's talking about the new commandant. They're all supporters, but given the current commandant and his current views, they are completely useless to me. So now I'm turning to you. Do you think it's right that purely because of this commandant and the women who dominate him,
Right.
do you think it's right that such a life work, he pointed to the machine, should be allowed to rot? Is that permissible? And there was a talk a little later about imagined scenario where the traveler tells the commandant what he's found. This is just what the officer is hypothetically putting to him. Say you go back to the commandant and say you tell him about the machine. Then there would be, here it is. You try to intervene. You say you never said what he claims. You never described my process as inhumane. He's saying like, well, what if, you were just taken out of context by the commandant who wants to shut me down? And you try to say you never said that. You never described my process as inhumane. According to your profound insight, you find it all too human and absolutely in accord with human dignity. You admire the machinery, but it's too late. You don't even get out on the balcony, which is full of ladies. You try to get attention. You raise your voice, but a lady's hand covers your mouth. And I and the work of the old commandant are both doomed. So perhaps they're living in a new age of liberal empathy, people who don't want maybe it's more feminine, the political atmosphere. Things are barbaric now that once seemed modern and progressive.
Where women rule?
Yeah, perhaps.
Or at least finally have influence. I actually am confused by it. I need to think about it.
It really came out of right field.
I could give a little biographical information about him on women.
Yeah.
So, okay. So he really he was a super duper hypochondriac, and he had a very involved family life. He lived with his sister from time to time, and he had a kind of very complicated relationship with an overbearing father, and I think his mother too was very involved in his affairs, and he also frequented brothels quite a bit, and on several different occasions asked different girls to marry him, and held long correspondences back and forth, but usually always from different cities. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters to these girls that he was engaged with, but he only would go and see them, maybe once or twice a year. He had tremendous anxiety about being in their physical presence, and was always putting off those meetings. And through his hypochondria, one of the ways that he was able to escape from his really oppressive family and his oppressive job, that he felt was oppressive, was by going to stay in these sanatoriums. He would beg off because of his health. This is before he came down with tuberculosis. But that was basically his method of getting away from everybody. Rather than standing up to the people in his lives, he just kind of would play sickly, and he would go and stay in a sanatorium. And that was kind of when he could focus on his writing and things like that. But living with his sister for a while was kind of a concession he made also in order to kind of be able to get on his own 2 feet. So he was kind of in a situation, kind of through his own creation in a lot of his life, where he was beholden to women but was very ambivalent about it, and he would create these situations out of trying to kind of have female companionship, but then having anxiety at the same time. And you can see in his letters, there's a lot of conflict there on his part. There's a lot of just difficulty in coming to terms with his own desires.
What was his relationship to his mother?
That actually I've read the least about. It seemed like of his female relationships, that one is commented on less, at least in what I've read. Mostly people talk about his father and his fiancées.
Was he gay?
Very much not, I think. Or at least there's nothing I've read to suggest that he had any homosexual relationships or any relationships with men at all. It was a lot of kind of put off physical relationships with these women he was engaged with, and when he had actual physical relationships with women, they were usually with prostitutes.
Right. So how does that reflect his use of the quote-unquote ladies in this story? Because they are kind of out of left field, and they kind of are kind of distant, but important.
I think there's some resentment there. Is my personal feeling. I think there's kind of some I think he projects onto women in a lot of situations a kind of oppression or a kind of an overbearingness that he maybe really is responsible for himself. I think you see this in other novels too. There's a part in America where the main character, he goes to this gentleman's house, and he's in the daughter's room, and he keeps trying to leave, and she actually wrestles him, and he can't out-wrestle her, and she keeps beating him, and he gets really frustrated, and I think kind of starts crying. It's just you get this sense that like he's just dominated by women, and he blames them for it, but he can't actually bring himself to stand up to them.
So, like in this story, he's saying somewhere that the women control the new commandant, correct?
That's the sense I got, or at least ostensibly.
Yeah, they're bending his ear. And I think that there's an idea that the new administration is more feminine. There was another line which I couldn't find again, but that it was the idea that the men were behaving more like women, or that the process was womanized. And so, it may seem that from the officer's point of view that this is a slight. However, to the story that we have, that kind of administration would seem better. It almost seems that maybe it's hopeful that women could turn a place into a world without machines like these. I'm not sure if it's necessarily a dig on femininity.
It definitely seems confused, which obviously seems to reflect Kafka himself and his approach to women. Right? Conflicted.
I would agree with that.
Conflicted and confused. But again, and then I think to myself, why are they there anyway? What did they bring to the story anyway, other than this concept that you are citing, Nathan, about the new administration is more feminine, or you know what I'm saying?
Yes, and it may have been that's not. I don't know how the political system works, though. Something like a court may be possible here, where it's a cabinet, a group of people who are influencing. So if you imagine having a bunch of war hawks or people who are rah-rahing a robust penal colony, and that certainly was the old commandant's administration. Each machine use was glistening and well prepared and organized, and all the parts were replaced, and there was a budget for it, and there even used to be other needles that put acid into the wounds, and that was more painful, but then they couldn't keep that up. And then so there has been a change in the new guard, and that is decidedly more feminine in the officer's view. However, that does seem to be, signaling a change in the way things are done for justice.
And the officer can't bear that.
Yes. So his view that women are ruining the world may not be Kafka's view, and it may be that the worldview of the story that women are actually doing a fine thing.
Right. Go ahead.
I was just saying, I was wondering if the women are, I forget in detail, but if they're just separated from the process of running the penal colony, if when they're mentioned, they're just always in the tea room or on balconies or in parties, and yet still they don't understand how the penal colony works, which is why the officer's so frustrated with it, or like a device like when people blame liberals about making statements about crime when, they don't understand crime or they're not in crime-ridden areas, the rich liberal, that kind of thing.
You in your ivory tower, you don't know what it's like to be in the pit.
Yeah, rich white liberals.
Maybe so. I think it definitely reflects a somewhat sexist view of women, or at least to me, it does suggest that. I mean, of course, as usual, there's different readings you could probably give to that, and it's sufficiently backgrounded and hazy so that, that probably could be supported. But
I mean, if all he could do in his life is go to brothels, then yeah, I mean, I have to say, yeah, there's going to be sexism in his work. And so
it sounds from the short biography you gave that, Kafka had an idea that, him as a man had work to do in this life. He had novels to write, and him getting involved with women and with marriage would be something that hinders him from getting, a man's work done.
Yeah. So,
yeah, I think...
Does he get to use his own machine? I think ethics...
Go ahead, Mary. No.
None of the women are named. And so if there's anything that's going to really hit you over the head as symbolic, then it's going to be this, weird reference to women just as the women. It's, they don't have a title. They don't have, none of them have names. I mean, if you think about it, the commandant could have had a wife. And if it were the commandant's wife, then it would have changed the character of the women.
Yeah, or the discussion.
Exponentially. Yeah, so the just the idea that it's the women, to me, is really fascinating. I think it really did pull me up short. I was, whoa, okay, the women, where'd they come from?
That's why he went to brothels.
I think he had it seems to me he had a really kind of fractured psyche. He had conflicting desires where he wanted these female companionship, and he did, seek that out and really enjoy it and credit it in these certain parts of his life. But then he had these competing drives to be isolated and to kind of shunt off human relationships and see that as a kind of bondage that held him back from. I mean, you see this with a lot of writers. I don't know, if any of you guys saw that Salinger documentary that came out not too long ago. It was really horrible, and I don't recommend it at all if you didn't see it.
Right.
But there was a part where it talked about, him towards the end. He had what his friends and family called the bunker, and it was just like this kind of bunker outside of his house, and he spent all day in there writing, and his family was just in the house, and he barely spoke to them. And you kind of just got this sense of a man lost in his own imaginary world, and he had so detached from the reality of human relationships. And I think in some sense that's a danger for some writers who maybe for those reasons are capable of producing great works, but, in order to do that, they really leave the realm of kind of on the ground reality.
That's why Hemingway drank.
Yeah.
Isn't it why we all drink?
Yeah. Sorry. I wanted to bring up the question. Actually, I want to ask about the ending of this story, because it kind of, I guess I'm just like this with the ending of all stories. I'm always like, my God, but what the fuck, And I was like, wow, the last line or the last words were kept them from jumping in. Remember?
Mm-hmm.
It was important. I thought it was a really important line because. Hold on, let me get to the end of the book here, because it struck me that it kind of reflected what was going on in the whole story. or in the whole about jumping in. Because remember, there's this pit underneath the machine.
Mm-hmm.
Here it is. They could still have jumped into the boat, but the traveler picked up a heavy knotted rope from the boat bottom, threatened them with it, and thus prevented them from jumping in. And remember, there's this pit underneath the machine, and I thought about that. I thought, well, this prevented these people from the two men to jump into the boat, and then there's this pit underneath the machine where what would happen is that the condemned person, after the needles did the whole execution and in their skin and stuff like that, then they were dropped into the pit, right?
Like I thought of it as the slurry pit.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And so, but that jumped out, not to use the word again, but that occurred to me when I read that last line, prevented them from jumping in. It's like it's preventing them from going into the pit that exists beneath the machine. I don't know. Because when you think about the traveler picked up a heavy knotted rope, I mean, why didn't the traveler just say bye, wave his hand? He didn't wave his hand as the boat was going away. He actually picks up a heavy knotted rope from the boat bottom and threatens them with it. So, like, if you look at the last line of this story, where it seems to us that where a change is taking place and this death machine is gone, and we're moving toward more of a question of innocent till proven guilty, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you look at the last line of this story, and you got the word threatened and prevented them from jumping in. I just thought, I don't know how much change is actually taking place.
Well, I think it's,
how much of a threat is a knotted rope? That was what I was struck by. It's like, pick up an oar. Like, there are all sorts of things on a boat. Pick up, some sort of little grappling thing. But he picked up a heavily knotted rope. And I thought, okay, so here we go. There's like the puzzle aspect.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking about that image, and I was thinking about why did he pick that up, and why this word threatened? I mean, I thought, anyway, correct me.
Maybe because they're too much of the old world. They're not welcome in the new world. You can't come with me to this new place, the place where we're actually civilized.
Yeah, but the traveler is doing the threatening.
Right, he doesn't want them in his world.
I agree.
Maybe, I don't know.
Why does he threaten? Why doesn't he just say, and just go? I'm just focusing on that word and why Kafka chose to use that word, why he said that the traveler was threatening these people and keeping them from joining him. And the word threaten is a word that, it gets very close to violent,
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's the kind of a breakdown of communication there between the old way of doing things and the new. It seemed like with the condemned man, at least, there was a problem of communication throughout the story. So maybe he was saying this, it's almost like you're trying to communicate with a savage or something who doesn't know language. He had to gesticulate. He couldn't just say, "Well, pardon me, sir. Please don't step into my boat."
Well, or I know, but I'm just curious about why, when I think about the writer's goal and intent and plan, he used that word. When we're coming off of a story now where things are in the process of change. The officer who was the holder of this past, historic use of violence through this machine is dead. The machine is dead. And things are changing. There's a new administration, but then one of the last words used in the story is the word threaten.
Yeah, well, and how funny.
Aggressive.
I mean, I'm sorry, please.
I was just going to say he's still communicating with violence, right?
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Because maybe since they're on the penal colony, they're still guilty, and there's no, he's not going to. I kind of got the idea that's just like, okay, I'm going to the new world. You're not really welcome. You're still, we might be changing where you are, but you're not really fit for our new society.
Well, I think that he's afraid of it. I think that the traveler sees a real horror, and he's disagrees, and he does not want to be part of it. And I mean, the prisoner and the soldier are there together, and though they're not party to the officer and the traveler's conversation throughout the entire process, they begin talking with each other. You know, the soldier lets his guard down, he drops his rifle, and then, so the condemned man is pulled back, but then later they start doing hand signals to each other and communicating and whispering. And then the entire reason for both of them is gone. Their chain of command is broken, their officer is dead, the machine is broken, crippled, and the condemned man is at liberty now. And so the soldier who was over the condemned man and the condemned man held by the soldier are now free agents together, and they run after this new world at the end. You know, they get caught up in a conversation, but when they realize that the travelers left the tea house after seeing the gravestone of the commandant, the old one, they chase after him. They want to go on board, and I think you guys hit on that.
But the soldier still is an asshole to the condemned man. He steals his hankies. Right? I mean,
ladies' hankies.
The ladies' hankies were obviously quite useful. And the officer had shoved them in his collar of the wool coat. He had taken comfort in them. So when the condemned man gets them back, the soldier immediately steals them from him and won't give them back. And there's a point where they're play fighting, but only half playing kind of thing. So there's that moment where the soldier still has power over the condemned man. So they might think that, sure, things are changing, but the soldier is still going to be brutal, and the condemned man is still being condemned. I don't know. It's a fascinating way to end a story.
It is.
Well, though, I think there's a common dejection that they both have when they're both running to the boat. At that point, I believe they're equals. They're both wanting to flee and escape.
Yeah, and the Travis is like, fuck you.
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't make sense to me. It just doesn't make sense to me. And I think about, okay, what's Kafka telling me here? And he's telling me that, there's change, but, there's going to be a new machine. But it's going to be different.
I think you're right. I think that means that if you're trying to protect the bubble by going back to the world you're from, where they don't do these kinds of things, and not wanting to let something cross over, but you have to keep people away, then it's not going to be sustainable. That there's going to be something where the need to get across breaks through, and then there's going to be this bleed over, or that maybe this is going to become manifest again because it's in our human nature. That Kafka's, the character in the story is, swinging this rope and trying to protect from, I guess, perhaps the injustice in the world or the badness, just like the commandant. I mean, these guys aren't criminals in some way. I mean, it's not justified, though they did commit a crime. So there is a value system, and that value system means, an improvement. Ideally, no one is punished. However, given the definition of the crimes, they're trying to change the world for the better, and this machine is not going to do that, though. But it is a response to justice, or it is a call from it, and it's ill. It's ill for the task because it's so unjust.
Well, and then there's the idea that we'll do what we can as long as it doesn't touch too close to home. We'll be as charitable and with money, but we're actually not gonna accept these people into our lives.
Yeah, like poverty tourism. I imagine that. Yeah. Someone that comes around, sees how awful things are, then wants to go back home to where it's cozy, and if someone tries to get on board with you and like, take me, no way, man. Like you're not gonna like ruin everything for me, or I'm not gonna let you possibly sully everything with the ways of the world that you're inscribed with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think this is a big difference between the explorer and the officer, because as brutal as the machine is, and as sincere and just complete as his devotion to that as a method of justice is, he actually performs kind of the only real act of clemency in the novel. He lets the condemned man go, and he submits himself to, all of the horrors that he's just described. So the explorer, in a sense, seems insincere compared to that. He, like you just said, he will utter, he'll make an utterance as to, his disapproval of this way of life. But that utterance is as far as he's willing to go to actually to do anything, and he second guesses even that. He's not going to let him into his boat.
He's embarrassed the whole time too. It's like the officer stands too close to him, reaches out and touches him. What he really wants to do is get away. He doesn't really want to see this.
Tell me why was the condemned man let go again?
Because of the verdict of the explorer.
Because there was no trial?
No, because the traveler said, I don't think that the machine is just. I don't think that this is, I think that this is wrong.
It's okay to
and so he
wrote.
Yeah. There's a way in which the traveler is horrified and affected by the apparatus, and yet, like we're saying, he doesn't actually come close to connecting with the humanity of the condemned people.
Well put.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah, that is well put. I was wondering, did you guys think there's anything... the theme of the body here is interesting to me, and the horror of this kind of execution is really lurid in the way that it deals with the body, and that kind of super vivid confrontation with mortality and carnality is, I think you could do a reading of this story that places the explorer in kind of a confrontation with that, and explain some of his reactions maybe as a recoiling from his own kind of mortal situation or existential situation as an incarnated being, confronted with the fate, the way of all flesh.
Well, and then the traveler at the end, I think, has his own story wrapped up. He's a passive participant, and he allows this procedure to take place, and he kind of sets in his mind that, okay, this is weird, but I guess there's justice in what the officer's about to do to himself. So I'm just going to let this play out, and I'm going to stay here till the end, but this is really horrible, and you guys should go home. I'm going to stay here because it just seems like that's my thing I'm witnessing, and I don't want to, though. And then, because he expects there to be this kind of occurrence, this kind of the expectation is completely thrown off, and then the machine is breaking. We talked about this before, but it's really horrifying to the traveler who is feels like, come on, we gotta stop this. This isn't what I expected, and there's this bit where he says he was forced to see the dead man's face, and it's this horror that he did not want to see. And even though he thought that he was on board for some kind of horror, he would have watched the described process from the officer, but when it's the real process, it's unexpected. It's not, and I think that that's very interesting because, what you're counting on is not what you end up encountering, and in both situations, so both with the officer, he didn't, I don't believe, expect to go under the harrow, and the traveler probably didn't expect to be involved in the process and trying to free this man. He wasn't active until then. So there's something about how the world works with values in here with the characters that tells a story that I'm just sketching out. I don't entirely. I need to think more on it. Interests me.
Yeah, interesting. That which would the the horrors of the flesh might relate well back to what you guys have been talking about with Kafka and his obvious body issues, sexuality issues.
The The theme of the body reminded me, and I'm sorry if I'm name dropping here, because I quite forget who this came from, but it reminded me, I think it was Foucault's book on punishment, and how back in the day, if you were just accused of accused of a crime or sentenced for a crime, they simply took their pound of flesh and that was the end of it. There was no moral condemnation. There was no checking if you were, psychologically sane. They didn't see if what your intent was. I mean, if you simply did a crime, as far as if someone was killed, they deemed it murder. They didn't care what it was. They took their pound of flesh. And then when that converted into checking for all these things like intent, giving people a defense, then that complicated things, and it was almost a passage from people accepting fate and that being easier than people accepting themselves as free beings and their actions leading to certain outcomes, which was almost more horrifying than simply getting, your hand chopped off and living the rest of your life, than being accused of being an immoral person.
Right, something about that they were actually honest that punishment was was not about the accused, it was about the accused or about the victim. Capital punishment, we're not killing this person for the benefit of the revenge of the people who have been wronged, be it society, family, whatever.
Yeah, it seemed that if you were condemned on this island and you had to go through this, if you simply thought of it as, there's nothing you can do, this is simply fate working its process, it'd be easier mentally than someone telling you that, no, this was a direct consequence of your freely chosen actions. And that's why we're going to do this thing to you. I've heard the same critique even, I forget who did it, of capitalism, that the only reason capitalism is thriving is because people inadvertently accept it as a fate, that, it's not a fair system, that if you're born into wealth, you're going to be wealthy, and if you're born poor, you're going to be poor and unsuccessful, and that if people really did internalize free choice in capitalism, that it would break down, because people would be so horrified in thinking that the bad consequences or the bad things in their life are directly as a consequence to their actions, that they're not successful because they're not doing the right things to be successful, for instance.
Well, and I think that's the understanding. I think that the bootstrapping notion is that kind of personal agency within the system, though not realizing that the function, the emergent, individual function of altogether, it's really kind of a numbers game. There's going to be a certain percentage that do, that do well, or there's going to be, there's that in the process, there's going to be discrepancies based on the system. However, if you don't see the system, then you see individual people, having outcomes one way or the other. And if you just say that they have free will, then it seems as though each person is in a place of desert, that this is what the space that they occupy is the one that they should.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think deserve comes into it at any point in the novel even, right?
No. Falling asleep at 2 o'clock in the morning because you haven't stood up to salute in the direction of your superior.
However, I did get something from that bit. He was the Batman, which at first I was like, okay, Batman, that's funny. But then I suppose he's the man that is in charge of the door to the officers' quarters. Though the reason that you stand up and salute, the officer says, is to keep yourself fresh through the night, so that the act of saluting is actually a function of awareness. And by not saluting, then you fall down in your duties of protecting, and then, you've left the door without a charge in front of it, to make sure everything goes all right. So, I mean, the guy did something bad. However, the punishment is, vastly unjust compared to it.
I thought that was kind of the most obvious place of, if you were going to do a religious interpretation. I mean, he didn't pray. He missed his prayer. So he's fallen down in the job of being of piety. And
the religion there being the bureaucracy, I suppose.
Yeah, or any form of religion. If you don't pray, you don't get into heaven.
Oh, I mean, similarly, the religion and the prayer would be the saluting and within the bureaucracy of having guard and everything. The religion of the penal colony.
Yeah.
Well, I like that falling asleep too. It's another failure of the body. It's another case of the body getting in the way of what's required by the order. You know, you saw a lot of this in the trial. You know, with Joseph K. just getting exhausted, not being able to, you know, keep up with the things that he needed to do, and how just the requirements of the system, you know, just wear on you, and we're not these things that can't be eroded, you know, that attrition occurs, you know, as we're put through, you know, cogs wear out. And, you know, the system as an abstraction doesn't account for the materiality of the body. It just pretends as if, you know, we're just these placeholders that are going to be the same tomorrow as they are today. And it makes no concessions for, you know, just the weird, crazy bodily functions that come unbidden, or the strange emergencies that you don't account for that, you know, come and, you know, beset you in terms of your health, you know, and change all of your plans. It's just, you're guilty. It's a foregone conclusion, you know, or you're summoned here on this day and you better be ready to go because, you know, that's the appointment. The system is going to make no time for you as an individual. And if you aren't prepared to accommodate that, you're going to be left behind. So.
Is that what he was saying in Kafka on the Shore? I mean, there's a lot of body work in that story. I mean, there's a lot of body metaphor and a lot of body action in that story. But is that what he's saying by bringing in the penal colony?
That's interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, remember how, oh God, what was the name of that character who just would sleep like for 36 hours?
Nakata.
Yeah, and then Oshima is like half male, half female. What is it? He has that blood disease.
Hemophilia.
Obviously, there's all these sexual things that go on. I mean...
Yeah, Hoshino with his back.
Right.
And Nakata being able to fix his back in this, you know, excruciatingly painful, but eventually very rewarding way.
Right.
All the pain that we suffer.
And it was hugely important to Kafka to go through these training rituals and keeping his body in shape and prepared, you know, so that he could be as tough as he needed to be.
Right, to be the toughest 15-year-old in the world.
Yeah, and one last thing, I think of Oshima's brother, who had a completely different lifestyle than Oshima, and a way that Oshima put himself in a library and a safe confine with abstractions. His brother lived on the boundary of the forces of nature, riding waves and tumbling into, you know, the water and, you know, taking damage and facing violence by turning it into, with his body and controlling it and riding that line.
And of all the characters in this story, he was certainly the most comfortable with his body. So, I mean, maybe Nakata had some level of comfort, but it was kind of through ignorance. But Oshima's brother definitely seemed the most comfortable in his skin character.
And perhaps also one of the more thoughtful characters, not one to speak very often, very internalized experience. And you know it was as deep as the experience that Kafka went through because they converged on the same hallucination, abstract soldiers in the woods.
Yeah, but he had somehow found balance.
Yes. And wanted to teach Kafka how to balance literally on surfing. Yeah.
I live near the ocean and I go watch the surfers all the time. It's astounding how wonderful it is.
It sounds great. Well, I wanted to put in, you know, maybe if anyone has highlights or something we didn't touch on.
I'm cool.
I think we got through it.
Yeah, I'm still going to wonder about the women. But
yeah.
Other than that, I was so happy with how open, what an open experience this was. nothing's. Boy, if you could have been heavy-handed with something,
Right.
then it could have been this. And yet, I really felt like this was written for our enjoyment. Take it as you will, interpret it as you will, and actually play with it. I really appreciate that.
I read somewhere that Kafka, I don't know, maybe you know about this, Daniel, but I read somewhere that he did a reading of this. I don't know if it was at a library or at some gathering. People had to leave. People left. A lot of people left because of the language was so brutal. The images were so brutal.
Yeah, I've heard of that. Some woman fainted as he was reading it or something. Yeah.
The women.
Those queens.
So delicate.
I'm going to go too because I got work to do. But
and I want to put in there, Daniel, you put a good note in the chat just for anybody listening. You know that there's that PEL episode 96 on Oppenheimer, so that would be something to check out as well.
Cool.